Welcome to the Austin Public Library Reading for Life podcast. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, director of the Public Library in Austin, Minnesota, and I'm here today with friends to talk about the book Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. The purpose of Reading for Life is to grow community around a shared love of literature. Real community begins and ends with our imaginations, and few resources are as vital to the imagination's development as works of literature. With me today is my co-host, Michael Verde, who founded Reading for Life in 2005. We're also joined today by Steve Harson, Public Library Consultant for Southeastern Libraries Cooperating, and Jennifer Lawhead, Director of Community Education in Austin. We're back for one more conversation, and I'll tell you guys, this one's really surprised me. This was not a book that I was super enthused to read, and yet we've managed to have one podcast and one lecture that really, really went well and was super fun. So I'm looking forward to some more conversation today to help us kind of wrap up this book before we move on to the next one.
Julie, I want to echo that. And so here I am, a public library director, and this book comes out. And everybody was so crazy for it and just infatuated with it and so wild that I decided, you know what, this book has to be drivel. I'm not interested in it. I don't want to read it. And so when you announced it, I was like, oh God, I suppose. And so then I gave it a try, and I was so pleased to find out that this is a wonderful, beautiful book that I think rises to the level of good literature.
I think it's easy as a librarian to become a bit of a book snob, and that might be what both you and I were experiencing, Steve.
Yeah. Well, part of it is that there were so many people lined up to get it. We had a ton of copies, as many copies of a book as we'd ever had on the shelves, and it was out constantly. And there's a part of me as the library director that I really don't want to compete with the readers in the community. But then when I started hearing this like constant infatuation, I thought, oh my God, it can't really be that good. And it is that good.
Well, maybe that's a good launching spot. It seems to me if you have that degree, and you use the word, Julie, enthusiasm, with that kind of turnout for copies, that obviously some of that could have something to do with Reese Witherspoon's book club and the kind of promotion, but not entirely. There must be, I'm guessing, something about the reading experience that is touching, striking a chord, speaking to whatever metaphor you want to use, something within the human imagination. So maybe a place to start would be, what do you think? And I'm kind of imagining myself now as an adolescent young lady. What is it about this story that would attract that kind of zeal? Maybe that's a place to start, and maybe even at the unconscious level. So I don't mean necessarily that someone would have to finesse out some exquisite literary aspects of it. Just what is sort of at the mythological level, what at the sort of primal level of identification might this book be striking a chord with? I think that would be a very interesting place to start.
I was thinking about this before and why there was such a connection to it. I think part of it is that we have a female protagonist that really stands up for herself. And I think that's something that as a woman, I'm really drawn to. It is not something that I see a ton in literature that I'm reading these days. So that's one of the connections I had, was just a real survivor story of a young woman. And I really identified with that piece.
Excellent.
Jen, I would say I agree with that. And I would even take it a step further. I think this particular book fits a particular motif that I believe is peculiar to American literature, of the noble savage. And Julie, you and I have talked before about how we can't think of another noble savage book where the noble savage was a female lead. And I think that there's probably a bit of an unconscious hunger for that amongst who were the readers for this book, which was mostly women. Mm-hmm. And that really appealed to people, and they may not even have been aware that appealed to them. And I have yet to find any book review or anything else that mentions that noble savage motif.
Yeah, I don't know a ton about, I mean, I know what you're talking about when you say noble savage, and I think you're right. I couldn't think of anything else either. And I wonder if part of it for me, kind of based off what Jen said, was that it was also that the connection to nature piece in the book really kind of reached out. But But Michael, I don't know. I don't know about the Noble Savage. Have you thought any more of that, or what would you think?
Well, I'd have to ask Steve sort of what he has, what Noble Savage brings to mind. But before that, and this could all be related, the survivor story. Until you said that, Jen, that didn't really strike me of how, speaking of semi unconscious or largely unconscious or perhaps not unconscious, how many young ladies, and I don't know, I've been in other contexts, I have been surprised when people feel that it's safe to talk. How many women will intimate, if not go into explicit detail, experiences growing up that were traumatizing around sexuality. So until you said survivor, that didn't occur to me that there may be a lot more going on just with that than I thought about. So that's the first thing I thought might be interesting to explore a little bit. And I would think that it would have to be a fairly significant something that Kaya experienced to justify, even in the reader's imagination, killing this boy or this young man. I mean, this is a story that at some point puts you in an interesting, I think, moral situation. Did what she experienced warrant what it is that she did in response to her situation? And we don't necessarily have to go down that way. I'm just saying it must have been a significant kind of wound that she experienced and that would make her survive. There had to be something that she was surviving. And maybe this is resonating with people. I don't know. I'm kind of yielding the floor here because I don't have that kind of personal experience with sexuality at an adolescent stage like that. But just when you said survivor, I just want to say that made me think of something I never thought of before. So maybe let's lean into that a little bit and then think about the Noble Savage. And maybe these two are somehow related.
Well, I think in regard to the thing that you're just discussing right now, you can also add coming of age, abandonment.
Well, and I was going to say that as a woman who has a child in college or went off to college recently, you know, all of the statistics are that 1 in 4 women in college will be sexually assaulted. And to me, that's a horrifying stat. So I think that's definitely playing on something that, and if not, you know, I recently had a very nasty name yelled at me out a car window as I was riding my bike home from the county fair. You know, I mean, as women, and I remember in the moment, my husband just kind of chuckled and he was like, wow, somebody needs a hug. But it hit him differently than it hit me. Like for me, I was kind of like, whoa, what was that? What did I do? And it brought up kind of all of these things. And so, yeah, I think I would say that is definitely a part of it. And I would say that there is definitely then a connection to the satisfaction that I almost hate to say out loud, but that the satisfaction you get as a reader with the conclusion of the book and all the ickiness that it makes you feel at the same time that you're satisfied and happy with how it goes down. Yeah. I mean, there's some real interesting.
Okay, that's super. That is a super, just want to say there that this degree of ambivalence between the primal yes and the civilized, well, now wait a minute. What I want to say that I don't know of any genre of writing outside of literature that can move into a space of ambivalence and do a kind of justice to it. I just want to throw that in. One of the contributions that literature makes to us as a people is that it gives us a place to turn to when we experience life at that level, beyond easy categorization or ethical stance taking. How do we know that it's, you know, where you're in a space like that, to read a book like this or another book has to be reassuring. Oh, you mean you can be human and not have easy answers? That's what I just want to throw out here. That in itself is satisfying, but not to deflect really from the sexual thing, because, you know, Freud came out and it said initially that 1 in 3 of the girls in Vienna were molested by their fathers. Now, that led to almost his being lynched, and he went back and amended it and said, well, maybe some of these girls are having fantasies about that and it didn't really happen. But I'm inclined to think that maybe he wasn't as far off the mark as he had to pretend to be when he recanted. So, maybe that's something that's going on, that you can't talk about reality. What I'm trying to get at is there may not be places in society to talk this real.
Well, Michael,
go ahead. That's what.
Michael,
but that's the idea.
In regard to that, the numbers for girls in the U.S. are 1 in 5 are victims of incest. For boys, 1 in 6, or sexual abuse. I'm sorry, sexual abuse. And there's websites. I think the boys one is 1 in 6, the number 1 in number6.org. And that's for the boys. And I think it's 1 in 5 for girls. And just a quick look at that would tell a person maybe a lot that might have meaning in regard to this book.
Yeah, there's something happening that we don't even typically talk about. I mean, this website is partly an exception, but how many people, if we were to get this is a major, you could say, issue in our society, but do we talk about it? Not too much, because the next thing you know, people you're asking to help you with this movement, they might be involved in it. I mean, there could be lots of respectable people, and this may cut across social and economic classes. So my point here is that literature, speaking about where the Crawdads sing and taking us in the beyond, literature may be enabling our imagination to engage with realities that we can't engage with at church. Maybe your therapist is an exception, maybe not. So that's the kind of literary idea here, is that literature goes where the Crawdad sings in lots of different ways, and this may be one of them with respect to this book.
But just think about what a remarkable storyteller you have to be to elicit the response from someone like me, who is, obviously very opposed to murder, and me thinking, I'm kind of okay with it. So really a compelling storyteller that convinced me that I wasn't too upset about that result.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. That makes me think, Freud says down there's an id, and the id is sex and aggression. And the id's not concerned about norms. It's not concerned about the law. In fact, the whole ego exists to somehow keep the id from ruining your life by teaching you how to dissimulate. Because if everybody knew what you were really thinking, they'd run you out of town. So I want to throw out there that maybe works of literature and the way language is used in literature is inviting aspects of our psyche that we ourselves have conditioned to stay beneath or in the corners. Invites those aspects of our psyche to start to get a word in edgewise. Your id wouldn't feel, my id, anyone's id wouldn't feel compunction. You see what I'm saying? That maybe there's a part of our psyche that we typically keep, we've learned how to not let it get a word in edgewise or to disguise itself. And maybe literature lets that part of ourselves come out and participate in maybe it enables us to come to terms with parts of ourselves that we wouldn't if there wasn't this medium that sort of brought it out. I think is a very interesting thing. And, Carl Jung's individuation is all about, you have these different personas, all these different archetypes that really are you too, but they're fragmented from your ego. And growing spiritually and emotionally is partly integrating even your shadow side, integrating those parts of yourself that you tend to be disassociated with. Maturity, emotional maturity, psychological health involves integrating these disassociated dimensions of your own being and accepting them as you too. So maybe I'm suggesting literature is contributing in a way by enabling us to talk to ourselves through symbols in a way that maybe even our pastor wouldn't be able to do. Well, what does noble savage mean to you, Steve?
Well, let's talk about it. Noble savage is a motif that was really popular in American literature in the 1800s and early 1900s. And it has to do with that Victorian age of exploration. An excellent example of a noble savage is Tarzan. Tarzan was this savage who lived in the jungle, and he swung from vines, and he, encountered the creatures and the new people and everything, and he lived a wild life. And you can substitute the marsh for the jungle, and you can substitute Kaya for Tarzan, and you've got something that fits that same motif. And in the noble savage motif, you also have that noble savage invariably comes up against civilization at some point. And there's almost a battle between the wild and between civilization that metaphorically has all kinds of ramifications and meanings. And in this case, I think it was like how, and it's often the case in noble savage books, how civilization ultimately overpowers the savage, damages the savage. And usually the noble savage is good, civilization is evil. There's this battle, the savage ultimately loses and is crushed, and but sometimes it works the other way. It just depends on the book. And I feel like we're constantly seeing that savage versus civilization. You used the words just a few minutes ago of uh, primal and civilized. Primal versus civilized. And I think in this book, we see many cases where primal and civilized come right head to head. And there's a couple of characters like what was the name of the guy who ran the dock?
Jumpin'?
Yeah, Jumpin'. Jumpin' is where he represents that, where those intersect. And the things that happen through Jumpin' are often mediations between primal and civilized. And I just feel like that is, to me, definitely the motif of the book. It's not necessarily the theme or the metaphor or whatever else, but that's what I think that makes it attractive, because I've been trying, I cannot think of another noble savage book where the lead was a female.
Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. The closest thing that comes to my mind, and it's not necessarily hitting the mark, is Wuthering Heights and Catherine Henshaw, but it may not be up I think your point is well taken, especially an adolescent young lady. Mm-hmm. You see this in Jane Eyre at one stage, and then she in effect says that I couldn't stay in this stage, when she basically Mrs. Reed, when she as a young girl puts Miss Reed in her place with this kind of fury that comes out of a place of ultimately of great capacity that she channels. After she puts Mrs. Reed in her place, she feels that wasn't good enough, that there was and then when she gets off to Lowood, she starts meeting Mrs. Temple, who teaches her, you can develop that. And in other words, she sort of grows out of the savage thing into this more whatever. So I think you're really, that must be something that's crucial, and that this book leaned into it at the depth that it did, or the extent that it did, might be one of the factors. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Something connected to that I was really drawn to in this story is I feel like in all those, I don't know if they're all noble savage stories, there's always someone who is a difference maker for that main character. Like in Tarzan, it was Jane. In this book, I think it was Jumpin' and Mabel, and then her attorney also. It just reminds me of the research that talks about troubled youth, and when they do long-term studies on youth that come from homes with a lot of the ACEs that we talk about, that most times when kids are able to break free from that trauma, it's one adult who's taken the time, who's seen them, who's invested in them, and so on. So the Jumpin' and Mabel piece really inspired me and really touched my heart. And I got so angry with the teacher who wasn't kind to her, because I'm a teacher. And for a teacher to not be kind to someone was just like the worst offense possible.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, Jen. Other parallels between this and say Tarzan. Tarzan turns out to be like, a wealthy, noble person, and goes to his castle and whatever. In this case, Kaya becomes a famous author. She gets recognition for that. She becomes a great poet. So she has her kinds of achievements that are really set her apart, that demonstrate her nobility. in ways that just being a savage can't do.
Well, and as part of that too, I think the idea of bringing to light like social constructs, the social constructs that we create that, I know having children who are kind of in that teenage phase and realizing that they don't see the same social constructs that I saw growing up, that especially for young women in this day and age, they're experiencing things very differently than I did in the 70s and 80s. And I think it's interesting to watch. And this is a little bit that too, that I think Tate in a lot of ways was drawn to Kaya because she didn't experience the social norms that he experienced, and he liked that about her. And what she kind of ran into with the other guy, Chase, was was those social norms, those social constructs, and how those change over time. And I think we're, I feel like we're in a really interesting time of changing social constructs. And I think these books kind of bring those things out too. And that might be one of the reasons, again, why this was really popular. Similar to how, and I can't believe I'm even bringing this up, but the Barbie movie, if any of you have seen the Barbie movie, there are some things in that movie that similarly bring up for women some really strong feelings of wanting to break free of some of those social constructs and how you do that. And the realization that men, and I think it's good for men too, because it's a different way of seeing it and understanding that your experiences are different. Right. And my favorite, has anybody seen this here? Yep. Jen has. You guys haven't seen it yet. It is worth a watch. I promise.
Oh, I want to see it. It seems
but one of my favorite scenes is Barbie and Ken they magically appear in the real world, and Ken is like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I've never felt so free and so loved and adored. And she's like, you don't feel do you feel like the world is dangerous or people are looking at you or it's kind of scary? And he's like, no, this is awesome. And it's that what women experience and what men experience in the world is very different. And I thought it brought it to light in an interesting way. And I think this book, in that same way, to an extent, is showing those social norms and how false they can be, those constructs, how really made up they are. And it's that highlighting of it and that ability to see the world in a different way.
That made me think. Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
Julie, I really like your use of the word constructs because I think those are definitely in play here. And I would add, and mythologies. Mm-hmm. And it's like one of the constructs and mythologies that the author takes on is that a young girl, does anybody in our society imagine that a young girl could live on her own and survive in the marsh, in the wild like that? And in the book, she does. And so it takes some of those on just head on and addresses them.
When you were saying, when the scene that came in my mind, we were talking about Barbie's discomfort, I was guessing that it had something to do with her appearance and the way people were objectifying her. Mm-hmm. And that made me think, now, okay, so we're thinking of nature here. This is, so in a sense, there's a degree of sexuality that civilization doesn't know what to do with, is one thing I want to say. Like 1984, isn't it, where this is really the one area that Big Brother is not able to contain in a way. So I'm just putting this as we're thinking about what we might be thinking about when we're talking about savagery, that these external landscapes of a marsh, for instance, or a jungle, how those may be symbolic of aspects of desire that really aren't containable by, as you say, constructs or even by a civilized world, and how much they're also absolutely vital to our lives. And yet, what do we do with them? And I suspect that's one of the things that happens here, is she was able to yoke her sexuality to a satisfying life situation with Tate, for instance. And, she found a place for that part of herself. That's one thing that comes to mind.
Well, and one of the things that I really liked about the book, and I think I mentioned this in the lecture too, is that part of why she does what she does is because she's watching nature, and she is watching what the fireflies do and what the praying mantises do. And so she doesn't have the social construct because she hasn't been raised in civilization. So she's following what she sees in nature, and in nature, that's how it gets taken care of. And she alludes to that again and again through the poetry and all of the different things. And it's kind of subtle until you realize what it is. And then it's really not subtle at all. In fact, I wrote in the book, at one point, because I finally caught on to what was going on. And it was during the trial. It was one of those flashbacks during the trial. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, I see where this might be going. And that was part of what I liked. I liked that part.
Your suggestion that nature, in other words, is what is her moral compass, that this is what she's going to grow herself in concord with, is how does it work in nature?
Yeah. As opposed to what you learn in school.
And speaking of ecology, I would say that would take us right to Adam and Eve, because isn't the fall related to awareness of your sexuality? I mean, yes. That's the part I want to say, that all of a sudden becoming conscious of your sexuality is what it is that exiled you, that cast you into East of Eden. Anyway, that our sexuality is an issue, and that we all have to somehow work it out in a satisfying way. Anyway, how does poetry help us with that in a way that the newspaper might not, etc.?
Mm-hmm. The type of reader I am is one that usually skims over description. That's just how I read. And I was drawn to this description. Like, this was very compelling to me as a person who doesn't appreciate that as much. And I thought she did a beautiful job of having me really be interested in her descriptions of the marsh and the different environments. I thought that was fun for me to experience something different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that gets to the word desire, Michael. I think I would add the word and fantasy, because who in our society doesn't fantasize about living in the little cabin lost in the forest, or up on the mountain, or on a beautiful mountain lake where there's nobody else around, or in the marsh? There's a certain fantasy element there. And like, who that lives in those kinds of environments doesn't fantasize about being involved in the urban and civilization kinds of activities and having a name for yourself? Those fantasies are at play against each other here, as well as the other kinds of things that are going on.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I wonder if at some level of desire that there really isn't a distinction between the fantastic and the plausible. At some level that division may be fairly a social, right. Maybe the imagination may not know the difference too much,
and in this book they go past the plausible into the fantastic, with like the girl literally taught herself language skills good enough that she wrote an academic level treatise that was respected worldwide. Yeah. I mean, that's fantastical. That's really kind of implausible.
I would say so. It would seem, and then she was secretly, HM. She was the poet,
right?
These poems. She was also a naturalist. She's also a painter. She's also a killer. Right. She's also a lover.
Right.
There's a lot going on there. She achieved a lot by the time she was. No wonder she got 65. It was just too much. What there was something I wanted to. I want to just throw in here before we. This Axis Mundi is a big deal in literature, and that's in any place where a transcendent dimension, typically thought of as heaven, meets earth. So it might be the top of a mountain, could be the top of a tree. Even incense, for instance, it serves this purpose because it's something that goes up. Birds are often associated with messengers from the, well, you can see pretty easy from the marsh, which really suggests something even beneath the earth, and a water tower, which would suggest a kind of pinnacle. You can see in this novel a very specific vertical dimension. And part of that verticality, insofar as it represents civilization, is like the Tower of Babel. It is a movement up that becomes increasingly sort of predatorial and exploitive. So that's a way you could think of the people at the top of the society that look down on her. Well, that's an up that is almost, in its worst case, is demonic. That's an up that you don't want to go to. On the other hand, you can think of a rise, for instance, the ecstasy of a satisfying sexual experience, say with tape. That would have been a kind of ascent that would have been positive. You can think of poetry that is enabling you to use language that rises above normal uses of language. Similarly with painting. So I'm trying to say there's two kinds of vertical axes. One that I'm comparing to the Tower of Babel, which is moving towards a kind of degenerate and master-slave society. And one that is a kind of liberation from that integrates what is most primal and what is most, you could say, articulate in us. So at Pentecost, the fire comes down and people are speaking in tongues. Well, there's a vertical axis there that is not reproducing a master-slave society. So all of that to say how the water tower functions as a question mark. Is this an ascent that leads to a fall, as in fact it did? And what are the kinds of places that start down, that rise up, that don't reproduce, let's say, this dominant subordinate hierarchy? That may be a little bit of an abstract thing, but the novel is clearly, from Mars to the water tower, playing with something about rising up in the world. And how do you rise up in the world without becoming just one more person in the high society that's looking down on marsh girls?
I like your use of the word "the fall" there, because it's so appropriate in so many ways. I would take that a little bit further, and how I see the symbolism is that water tower represents civilization imposing itself on the primal environment. And I don't think it's any accident that that's the place where the resolution happens.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's beautiful. That's reading for life right there. This is the way that these images are speaking at a subtextual level. These are the way the images are getting a word in edgewise. And these kinds of images you'll see coming up again and again. You can imagine every one of our novels, if you thought about it. The Song of Solomon starts out with somebody leaping off the top of a building with wings and immediately is dead. There was an interesting kind of fall. So the point I want to just throw out here is how, with utterly different content, you nevertheless have structures within literature that keep bringing our imagination back to a common sort of space for the kind of conversations that we're having right now. And that's, I think, one of the these are primary concerns that we're having, conversations that we're having. When's the last time you sat around and talked with four people about how many young ladies are sexual survivors and what that relates, how that relates to poetry? But in fact, this is probably an important kind of conversation to have if you want to have maximum consciousness. You can imagine that if you're watching TV, you won't be thinking in this kind of way. So literature, I'm suggesting, is bringing us back to these primary kinds of concerns, and the conversations that emerge when you bring people together to talk about primary concerns don't happen often. You see what I mean?
When you were talking about that vertical, I was thinking about the bird feathers that they exchanged back and forth. And birds are the one thing that can go from the marsh to the top of the tower. So I wonder if there's something in there.
Or even beyond the top of the tower. I think that's the perfect insight, that if you were going to contrast the tower, in other words, the tower, as Steve pointed out, is a vertical axis that I think leads to a kind of hellish social world where it's exploitive. So you got a top and a bottom. That's a dominant subordinate hierarchy. So that's a vertical that's not positive. But the bird symbol represents something that can go even higher than the water tower, without anybody being exploited. You see, I mean, we don't have to have people at the base of the pyramid if we're going to have a pharaoh. With music or with poetry. You see, no one has to be down there for there to be people up there. That's what I'm getting at. How is it that we rise? Partly, I'm guessing we don't want to say that we want to go back to nature, because there's a lot of things I don't think we would associate with spiritual maturity that are just primal. So how is it that we can, let's say, grow spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, imaginatively without simply going to the top of a social pyramid where we become the upper class? That I think is an essential question to anyone growing up. I can imagine I don't have teenagers and my cat never had these issues, but I can imagine talking to a young person and you see them starting to look at things and that are presented to them in all kind of manipulative ways. And you could start to hear someone say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to own that. And maybe as a parent, you're thinking, is that really what you want to grow your life around, accumulating those kind of images? And yet I'm sure you do want your young person to grow up and be fertile and have a wonderful life. So how is it that you find a life that is generative, that is other than what your social landscape might be enticing you to do to keep up its pyramid, if you see what I mean? How do you grow up without just doing the upper lower class, see at the top, and then he who has the most toys dies? When they die, wins. How do you not do that and yet still mature? Do you see what I'm saying?
I do think, Michael, that in American popular culture, we do tend to equate primal with purity and spiritual.
Tell me what you're thinking there.
Well, I mean, when people talk about a spiritual experience, or they go on a hike in the woods, that was a spiritual experience, and they think of that as being pure versus their little house in the suburbs, and they don't see that as pure.
Yeah, okay, that's wonderful. That's it.
Yeah.
So that's the insight. So in other words, one way to not reproduce this social vertical pyramid is going to these natural landscapes. Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm suggesting, though, how do we have a vertical? And I think this bird thing is really getting to it. How is it that we do rise without simply moving on up like the Jeffersons? That's really what I'm getting at. How do we rise? And I would think every educator must be invested in this conversation. Can you imagine you're working, let's say, with some marginalized youth, and the next thing you know, man, owning these Air Jordans or owning this whatever, you can imagine any number of ethnic trappings here is the meaning of being successful. You might start feeling, how can I help this young person know that you don't have to accumulate things to indicate that you're at the top. You've got these, do you see what I'm getting at here? Mm-hmm. And I do think the bird is a great symbol of things that enable us to ascend, that we don't lose touch with our primal things. So you're not losing touch with these desires. And yet they're found in expression that is not simply participating in a economic system in which some people are being exploited so other people can do, illicit drugs and take trips to, I don't know, where do people go? Martinique or something. In other words, how can we develop without everybody trying to just make it to Hollywood you see what I mean? This, I think, is a big issue. And literature might be a special kind of conversational space.
I was going to say, we need to read more books. We need them to read more books.
Partly it, right? That you could see something would actually be more interesting than accumulating a bunch of stuff. That your mind is actually too precious and capable to spend a lifetime using it in that way. But if you don't see an image, I'm saying, if you don't have an image to compete with what TV is coming up when the mall's doing, I don't know that a young person has a prayer.
But what a gorgeous life philosophy to teach our young people, that you can be the bird, that you don't have to be ascendant over someone else for you to be successful, but that you can rise independently like the birds do. I think that should be our goal in our parenting and our leadership of youth.
I love that. And what, I think now that you mention it, how much diversity is symbolized through those birds. to the bird images, right? Because there's all these different kinds of birds. She knows them, which I'm suggesting with regards to diversity here, that we could have maximum diversity and still have community. Whereas the pyramid or the water tower is probably increasingly uniformity. You got to, if you're going to be in the cool group, you probably have a fairly constricted range of how you can talk, what you can wear. So I'm saying here is another contrast between the artificial ascent and the ascent that is really spiritual maturation, is that diversity and unity are not in tension with any other. Nature has maximum diversity and maximum unity. So do you see what I mean? Everything in nature is related to everything else, and yet it is infinitely diverse, from amoebas to water buffaloes. How could we have something like that in a human community where we had this kind of diversity that nature has without us trying to eat each other, if you see what I mean?
Additionally, besides going high, birds go far. And in that sense, I feel like the birds are metaphors for Tate and Kaya. Most of the other characters don't really go far. They stay bolted down in place. But those two are like birds in that they travel away and they come back, like with a migration kind of a thing. And I think that's also part of that bird.
That's wonderful
Metaphor.
The more we grow, the way she did with learning to read, with learning to paint, she was very invested in the details, the specificity. Those were the same attributes that were enabling her to contribute to these articles. In other words, her life was expanding. And as you say, it was as she was learning more and more about her own location. So this is a great way that deep and wide, in the Baptist church, we had to sing deep and wide growing up. I don't know if you did that, but here's a way that going deep is also enabling you to communicate widely over diverse kinds of range. Well, anyway, I think these are ways that we can think about growing that don't reproduce a pyramid of exploitation, is what I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Michael, I'm going to be singing deep and wide for the rest of the night because I remember that song like it was yesterday.
There's a river flowing deep and wide. Julie, you were thinking of
something. I've been trying to remember. So when Tate, had taught Kaya to read and he was bringing her all the books, I remember him bringing her a lot of science and nature. I don't remember them ever talking about him bringing her literature. He brought her poetry. But I do think it's interesting that, in a way, based on kind of the discussion we've had, if that, I don't know, I would have to go back through the book and see, but if there was a lack of literature and a lack of some of those mythologies, again, it kind of plays into why she did what she did with Chase without any remorse. Without
I like that. That's a shameless plug for literature. I love it. That had she not only read poetry, she wouldn't have killed this young man.
Well, yeah,
I'm being cheeky.
No, but I kind of, that is kind of my point, because if you think about, like, when you talk about the noble savage, or you think of people who maybe they didn't have the best education, but they read all of the books in their library. They read all of the literature and they learned all of those tropes and all of those mythologies. And they had a really good education in those things. That creates a life that is very different than someone who would have been raised only learning the science of nature and those pieces. There is still beauty and there's still art, but you're not getting some of that other piece. And it just kind of, in my mind, it kind of lines up.
I think it's powerfully insightful. I mean, honestly, I think it's insightful.
Right. And Julie, think about in Minnesota, we don't have the marsh. What do we have? We have the North Woods. Mm-hmm. Who do we have up in the North Woods that's kind of like this character? Dorothy Moulter, maybe? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I can think of some other characters as well. Mm-hmm. Up there, you would call that a Northwoods intellectual. Mm-hmm.
If I follow you, Julie, then there could be, we think of poetry as one use of language on one end of a spectrum, primal. You don't even have to have syntax, grammar. Mm-hmm. Or if we think of uses of language in the context of scientific journals, where it's really disassociated from affect. And in fact, you want to get out of it the kind of subjectivity that poetry is saturated with, and that these two polar things there's a lot of ways in between with different uses of language. And that's, I think, one of the things that's insightful is this also really does explain Jane Eyre in a very interesting way, that she has to learn how to integrate her story with her emotions and her intellect. That's really what I want to get at. We had fire people and ice people. And what you've said is the science is ice, poetry is fire. How do we integrate ice and fire so that we get something that is generative? And I do think that is a profound insight. And I do think she's specifically playing on that in some ways.
It seemed like Kaya was missing a little bit of that piece of that interplay. She didn't have that opportunity for that. And that was the one thing I could think of was, well, she wasn't reading any literature. Tate wasn't bringing her, Jane Eyre or.
Yeah. I also think that's kind of why it was necessary for her to die young. What was going to happen for the rest of the novel if she didn't die? What were they going to do? In other words, in a way, everything was so at the extreme. How are you going to integrate a kind of normal, what you would think of life without this drama going on? So, I mean, I'm just kind of connecting it. It was probably needing, because she did disappear in 65. That's unusually young, right? I'm thinking maybe there really wasn't the resources there.
Everything was done.
Everything, the novel was finished.
Yeah.
But you could imagine the novel ending without her dying that way. So there was something. You could imagine someone, saying, yeah, this kind of life isn't sustainable. This is why this character didn't go off in the own golden pond, because that's not how this character wasn't pre-wired to ever make it to golden pond. And anyway, so I think that's interesting what you just said, basically, that there is this spectrum of uses of language from the most, let's say, subjective and emotionally saturated or infused to the most emotionally bloodless and precise, in fact, taken out, and that there's all kind of uses of language in between, and that certain works of literature are working with both of those. I think that's absolutely the case. Well, this has been a lot of fun, guys.
Good stuff.
I think that a lot of what makes this book so successful as a work of literature, to me, think of all the things that we've hit on today that are different themes, different motifs, different metaphors, and almost any one of them, you can think of examples where an entire novel is built on just that one thing. But this author just took all this stuff, and it's massive, and it's very complicated, and wove it together into a single story. And I can tell you why she died early. That character was tired. They had done everything that there was to do. And as a character, they were tired.
Yeah.
We have exhausted what we can do with one character. She had to die. And so, every possible type of literature, every type of conflict, every single thing is in this book. It's a very complex thing. And I feel like that complexity, for me, is what raises this to the level of literature.
Wonderful. That's a great note to go out on there. That was very well expressed.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much for some great conversation. Kind of wrapping up Where the Crawdads Sings and getting ready to move on to Ursula Le Guin and The Left Hand of Darkness. I would highly recommend, if for no other reason than just for the introduction, that you check out the audio version that has the introduction. I've read this book a couple times, and I got the audio the other day and just listened to the introduction, and I had to stop and go back and pick up the heart, because I was like, did I read that? And I did, and I had written in it even. But hearing someone say it out loud, to me, this book is the next one is really fascinating too, and I'm super excited about our conversation moving forward. And I just thank you all for your participation today, and I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have.
I have.
This book has been a lot of fun.
Good, great.
Thank you, everybody. Jen,
thank you.
Good to see you, Julie.